Hi, welcome back to Variety Tech Today. The blockbuster is back with the latest Spider-Man film passing $1 billion just like old times. But how did it turn out? Well, first things first, let's take a look at all the ones that led up to this. Well, before the MCU even started, in the early 2000s was when superhero movies really came back. These big superhero blockbusters had really started in the 70s and 80s, like with Superman. Then there was a period where they weren't such a big thing, and then they came back with a vengeance. And then with the MCU, they got even bigger. But before that, standalone stories were more of the thing, not this interconnected universe stuff. And one of these that put the superhero blockbuster back on top was the original Spider-Man film from 2002. And in some ways, this kind of felt like the last, while it was the beginning of a new era, it felt like the last classic superhero film of a basic classic hero's journey before things got too complicated. At least that was the feeling that I got. This eventually turned into a trilogy with 2004's Spider-Man 2 and 2007's Spider-Man 3, the year before the MCU started. Now keep in mind, this was before Marvel was unfathomably successful as they are today. So the distributor of those films, Sony, or Columbia, which Sony owns, actually had or has rights to make Spider-Man movies, even though Marvel technically owns them. Only Sony can make them. So even though by 2012 the MCU was in full swing, pun intended, in fact, the MCU had just finished Phase 1 with the Avengers, the team-up film, Sony decided to reboot the Spider-Man series and make a new one, a new continuity with Andrew Garfield, and this time they called it The Amazing Spider-Man. And these were in the 3D era, so they started to be released in 3D. Now, as for the films themselves, the style definitely took a more modern at the time change. I say at the time because modern is always subjective. It's always relative. What we think is modern now might be cringy 10 years from now. In the original Spider-Man trilogy, some of the supporting characters had more of a picture-perfect look and somewhat more influenced by the comics, such as Peter's aunt and uncle. They were that quintessential old couple, as well as his boss at the newspaper. You know, he looked like he was practically drawn. He was such a character. But here, his aunt was Sally Field, and they weren't as picture perfect, and their acting style, the directing style, really was intentionally, and they even said this in the extras, was intentionally done to have a little bit more of a free feeling to it, a faux naturalness, a lot of stumbling and talking over each other. And I think some parts worked better. For instance, in the original trilogy, I thought some parts were either cringy or unbelievable, such as Peter Parker's confrontations with the bullies. Maybe your opinion is different. I thought they were a little bit over the top, a little bit too much of a boyhood fantasy acted out, and just little stylistic choices that pushed it too far, like having him flip multiple times or having him drag a web connected to his lunch tray in full view of everyone with no consequences. It was just a little bit over the top. Catching MJ and her gushing a little bit, yeah, they could have reined that in a little bit to make it more believable. And in respect to those aspects of the story, I thought Amazing Spider-Man did that a little better. I more so enjoyed those scenes, like where he was teasing the bully on the basketball court, and then actually the bully being nice to him later. Now, as for the 3D, throughout the whole thing, I was under the impression I was watching a conversion, and I was wrong. Why is that? Because it was on the weak side. And this was made in 2012 after all, so that would be perfectly understandable if it was, because conversions were in their earlier days at that time. But in the extras, and by the way, this is one of the few Blu-rays that has extras in 3D. Not all of them, of course, but it has some on the main 3D disc. They do talk about 3D some, which is exciting for someone who loves 3D because you don't get that in extras much. That's usually skimmed right over. but they show actual 3D examples of things like the interaxial and the difference that makes, as well as convergence. And they show the camera, the type of camera it was filmed with, the 3-reality camera rig, which is a mirror rig. And that explains the minimum depth. Not that it's inherent to it, but that it's possible with it. As you can see in this image, it's a mirror rig, so essentially you can get as close as zero parallax, as if it were one lens, because you've got one camera here, filming off a reflection off a high quality mirror, and you can achieve an interaxial as if two cameras were partially melded together, overlapping each other that close. So it's great to get full flexibility of depth of interaxial. But in this case, they downplayed it, and he actually even says it in the extras. He says right here that they didn't want to risk having strained vision over long periods of time, and he says that they were deliberately staying within what he called a depth budget. And you can understand the fear. 3D was newer at this time. There were, as always, complainers like, oh, I've got a headache or whatever. But as was usually the case, the problem was with them and their vision and their biology, not with the actual 3D. Strong 3D done well is just fine. So if you try to placate those people, nobody's going to be satisfied, not even them. Trying to placate 3D haters with what you might think is better 3D for them is just as fruitless as trying to placate Star Wars prequel haters with new movies, like the sequel trilogy, and then nobody wins. But anyway, you can see an example of it in this shot here. This shot here is actually similar to what many, many shots in the film are like. In all the common shots that are calm or conversation, things like that, it's almost zero parallax. It is subtle depth, but it is almost zero parallax. Very little background separation at all. So if you look without your glasses, you could possibly not even see any blur, or very little if you look for it. That being said, I still think 3D is definitely the best way to watch it, because it's not like that all the way through. There's still a number of moments that 3D really make it worth it, such as, of course, some of the action scenes with deep backdrops. That's when it's stepped up a little and you get more depth, like on top of the skyscraper, things like that. You got some computer graphics in there, and of course that can be done well in 3D because they can adjust the interaxial virtually after the fact to make it just right. You've got some shots of spider webs that are like coming across the screen, and angles stretching into the distance always look good like this. And you've got a few pop outs, like when he's learning how to use his powers at first. This was a really cool shot. And there is one, I'm going to say one extreme pop out, one wow moment. But it's very, very brief. If you want to pause it, it's worth it. It's worth pausing, just to ogle a little bit. It's an overhead shot of the cityscape, passes over top of a skyscraper with a point on top, and that point comes right in your face, like this. If you're watching this in 3D, it comes in your face like that. And then 2 years later, in 2014, came The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And this just goes to show that the whole native 3D versus converted 3D is utter hogwash in this day and age. What matters is how you do it, nothing else. That hasn't been an issue for a decade now, and yet some people still bring it up. So you've got the native 3D of The Amazing Spider-Man 1, which was very weak for the most part, and even the strongest scenes were moderate. And then you've got The Amazing Spider-Man 2. In the extras, the director brings up how he went back to shooting on film for this one. It was post-converted, and it's way stronger 3D. So yeah, go figure. Anyway, it's got a very interesting scene early on with a sort of a underside point of view while Spider-Man is swinging throughout the city. That's very unusual and highly effective in 3D. And speaking of point of view shots, in the first movie, this relates to the second one, by the way. In the first movie, the original teaser trailer for it that was shown theatrically was an extended point of view shot from Spider-Man's perspective of running and jumping and swinging until finally he lands on a reflective building and you see his costume in the reflection. So, especially in 3D, it felt like you were Spider-Man. However, this shot was largely cut from the actual movie itself, and it wasn't included on the Blu-ray. I think they realized this error because they usually don't put trailers for older movies on Blu-rays, but with Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man 2, they did. They included on the 3D disc this 3D teaser trailer for the first movie, the extended teaser in 3D. So you get to relive that full point of view scene. And as I said, the movie itself has a lot of great 3D in it. One reason being that one of the villains is Electro. So you've got a lot of awesome glowing electrical shots that are just eye candy in 3D. Lightning bolts going this way and that way and all kinds of layers going on. 3D is the only way to see this. As for the story itself, it's fun, it's good. I would say it's a little bit weaker than the first. It's not quite the same as the original trilogy as Peter Parker just being an ordinary kid in an extraordinary situation. This one has more of a chosen one element put into it, where it all goes back to, well, I won't even go into it. But yeah, suffice it to say it's not quite the same. There's also a little bit of a villain overload, kind of reminiscent of Spider-Man 3 from the original trilogy. Besides Electro, you've got this new version of the Green Goblin, which I'm not going to say is entirely convincing. It's a little bit cartoonish, actually. Just for me, it clashes a little bit, and the segue to it was a little bit too abrupt and forced. And you've also got Rhino show up at the end, but that wasn't meant to be as serious. It was more of a fun thing, and there were a lot of these fun moments, including Spider-Man just like hanging out with the firefighters, helping to save the day. He's even wearing the fire helmet, and that was kind of reminiscent of the toys that they made of Spider-Man and the other Marvel heroes that were actually rip-offs of Fisher-Price Rescue Heroes, right down to their scale, their big feet, the chips on their back. They were even compatible, but they were made by different companies. Anyway, that's what that reminded me of. Now, in the meantime, of course, the MCU was going on, and as we know, Spider-Man was again rebooted, but this time as part of the MCU. And he not starting off with his own movie, traditional origin story. No, it just got right into it. In fact, he showed up before he had his own movie and got integrated into the story, and then got his own movie, Spider-Man Homecoming. And then in 2019, Spider-Man Far From Home. But before we get to No Way Home, also in 2019, there was the Spider-Man movie that really changed the course of things. The animated Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Yes, this set the stage for having the parallel universes collide. The story was involving this large device that accidentally brought in people from parallel universes. It brought in various versions of Spider-Man from different universes. And by the way, this was also seemingly inspired by Doctor Strange, because you got some of these images of city buildings being transformed by this interdimensional whatever. That's a technical term, by the way, interdimensional whatever. Not really. First, you've got Miles Morales, who eventually becomes the Spider-Man in his universe after Peter Parker is killed. And then you've got Peter Parker from another universe come in, slightly different, and slightly less in his prime, a little overweight, split up with Mary Jane. Plus some of the weirder corners of Marvel history, such as Peter Porker, who basically looks like Porky Pig in a Spider-Man suit. You got an anime version of this little girl with a spider robot. And then you've got the black and white, moody detective Spider-Man, who's voiced by Nicolas Cage, by the way. And I just thought this was a delightful, outside-of-the-box way to approach a film, and it really I think it emboldened Marvel to go ahead with the latest Spider-Man movie, the same concept of this interdimensional parallel universe, and bringing back obscure or alternate versions of the franchise. It worked super well and was a lot of fun. And even though it was animated, Stan Lee got his cameo. And this film also had some interesting stylistic choices for an animated film. It wasn't your straightforward CGI animation. It was made to resemble more of a comic book, not only in straightforward ways such as having text on the screen in various ways, but also having clear, harsh lines, dark outlines, as well as fringes of colors, as if the four-color printing is unaligned, off kilter a little bit, and as well as some dots, as you can see those circular dots. So kind of resembling like a newspaper comic or a comic book that wasn't printed to the highest technical quality standards, but at this point in time has sort of a nostalgic look to it. And besides those factors, there was also the fluidity of the character's movement. It had more of a stop motion quality. And this was explained in the extras. The purpose of this was that the director thought that when you look at panels in a comic book, they're kind of like works of art, each individual still picture that you can look more clearly at. So instead of having constant smooth movement, he wanted those images to stay a little bit longer. So although it had jerkier movement, less fluidity, those images would stay with you a little more. You see them a little bit longer. So from those standards, it's a very good looking movie, visually pleasing. And you would think that this would translate excellently into 3D, and it could have. But they somewhat failed not only on the parallax, the interaxial, but also on the z-axis, the alignment. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the 3D. It's not bad. It's not inaccurate or anything like that. It looks fine, but it could have been so much better. For the vast majority of the film, there is again not a lot of depth, and this was made in 2019. So and it's computer animated, so they chose not to dial it up, and they could have, and it could have been outstanding, coupled with this great animation quality. There are some scenes that step it up to medium-ish 3D, such as cityscapes when he's flying there through the city. That looks pretty cool in 3D. It could be more powerful, but that is the extent of it pretty much. As well as the usual suspects like particle effects, in this case snow. And nicely, they even had the snow fall a little bit slower. So there's more time to grasp what you're seeing and enjoy it in 3D. But otherwise, there were several scenes that were just a pop-out waiting, begging to happen, and it just didn't happen. Such as this point of view shot of her bringing the Q-tip up. Didn't happen. Didn't pop out a bit. And this is the female version of Doc Ock, by the way. Speaking of her, look at this shot with her octopus claw reaching out to the screen. If you look at the blur, I know there's not much of it because there's not much layer separation, but what blur there is, do you notice anything wrong with this picture? That's right, all the blur is behind the screen. The claw itself is aligned at 0 parallax. This means that this shot that you would think would be designed to come right out of the screen, and it's perfect for it because there's nothing obstructing the frame. It could easily be a pop-out. They chose to align it all behind the screen, 100%. Same with this other shot of a beam falling towards you. There it comes right at the screen, and almost all the depth is behind the screen, and it barely breaks the z-axis by a fraction, and only then for 1 or 2 frames. So yeah, a huge missed opportunity in my opinion. Again, as I always say, 3D is still my preferred way to see it, but it was a huge missed opportunity. And now, Spider-Man No Way Home. From a 3D perspective, just great. Nothing wrong with it. It's as we'd expect. 3D conversion has come a long way, and it's just the quality you would expect it to be of all the MCU films of late. From a story perspective, also great. Pretty sure by far the biggest grossing movie of the year, and for good reason. I mean, Black Widow was okay. Shang-Chi and Eternals were a little bit better. Um, but Spider-Man No Way Home is not only epic, but just plain fun. If you haven't seen it, here are some spoilers. So that's your opportunity to exit the video. But I mean, who doesn't know this by now? Again, the Spider-Verse is open back up again. And yet again, more Spider-Mans meet. But this time it's the live-action ones. I went in spoiler-free, and I'm glad I did, because what a fun time to see Tobey Maguire reintroduced, Andrew Garfield introduced, to see them all getting along. A lot of funny lines and humor that go along with that. Returning villains as well, and some really interesting, thought-provoking story that goes along with that. Just stuff that you would not expect them to do. Some bold choices here, but really good ones. And opening up a world of possibilities. And will it make it to 3D Blu-ray? That we don't know. Because, as we know, Disney has been at least releasing their 3D Blu-rays of Marvel films in Japan only. But this one isn't released by Disney. In their agreement with Sony, they allowed it to be in the MCU and to share characters, but this is a Sony movie, and they haven't been too good with 3D. They have been working with random space media, such as to release a couple of other films that didn't expect to get a 3D Blu-ray release long after the 2D one came out, such as Jumanji: The Next Level and one of the Hotel Transylvania movies. But in other cases, they just came right out and said that they're not going to work with them, and there's nothing Random Space can do about that. There seems to be no rhyme or reason for selecting certain movies, not selecting others, and they have to, and it entirely depends on what the studios want to do. So they could decide to release it in some country or through some means in the future, but there's really no indication that they will. There's no word of it yet in any form, so it's really a guessing game at this point, which is a shame and foolish on their part and every other studio's part. But who knows, considering the incredible popularity of this latest movie and how successful it was not only with fans but with critics, you never know, maybe they might make an exception. Alright, that's about it. I will see you next time.